I slammed my fists into the alien door over and over, not giving a single fuck that it was built to withstand my pathetic human strength 100 times over. Humans do not fear anyone, especially not when they wake up in an unfamiliar stark white prison cell after their colony ship has been shot down over some irrelevant Tarkalian planet. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing a tall blue-skinned creature with 4 spindly arms. It regarded me with cold, unblinking eyes. "I am Lyra, your Tarkalian captor. Your primitive ship crashed on our world. You are the only human survivor we found." Her voice was flat and emotionless. I lunged for her throat, but an invisible force slammed me back against the wall, pinning me. "What have you done with my crew? Where are the other humans?" I growled through gritted teeth. "That is not your concern. Your violent species is now our prisoner indefinitely. Be grateful we saved your insignificant life." The force released me and I dropped to the floor. Lyra turned and glided out, the door sealing shut behind her with a resounding thud, leaving me alone in my cell. I picked myself up and stared out the small window at the unfamiliar constellations. The Tarkalian ship hummed with alien energy, carrying me away from everything I knew and loved. My crew was gone, likely dead. I was utterly alone here, a despised, primitive creature, helpless. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm me, defiant human anger sparked to life in my chest. I didn't care what the Tarkalians thought of humans. They had no idea what our species was capable of. I would find out what happened to my people, no matter the cost. I would prove that the human spirit could never be broken or contained. One way or another, I vowed, I would show the Tarkalians how deeply they would regret ever thinking they could imprison one of us. The entire human race would burn this ship to ashes if they had to. Starting today, I would make it my mission to strike the fear of humanity into their cold alien hearts. Days stretched into weeks as Louis paced the confines of his sterile white cell. With each passing hour, his rage and resolve only grew, hardening into an unbreakable core. He committed every detail of the guards' schedules and routines to memory, searching for the slightest crack in their defenses. Then one day, opportunity arrived in the form of a new guard. The Tarkalian strode in, carrying a tray of the usual tasteless nutrient slop they called food. But as the guard set the tray down, Louis noticed something the others never let happen. The cell door remained unlocked. The guard had forgotten to secure it. Louis didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, locking his arm around the guard's neck in a chokehold. The Tarkalian thrashed and clawed at Louis's arm, but Louis only squeezed tighter, until the guard went limp. Louis dragged the unconscious body further into the cell, stripping off the guard's uniform. He quickly shrugged into the too large clothes, heart pounding. This was his chance. Trying to mimic the stoic demeanor of the Tarkalians, Louis walked stiffly out into the curving corridor of the ship. He kept his head down, 4-fingered hands balled into fists at his sides as he passed other guards. Adrenaline coursed through him, certain any moment they would raise the alarm, but no one spared him a second glance. Louis wandered the labyrinthine halls, pulse racing with every corner turned. He had to find out what these aliens had done to his crew. Ducking into a restricted access passage, he came upon a cavernous laboratory. His eyes widened at the sight of rows upon rows of stasis pods, an eerie green glow emanating from each. Heart in his throat, Louis approached the nearest pod and wiped away the condensation obscuring the glass. He recoiled in horror. There, suspended in the pod, was the slack face of his communications officer, Maya. She looked dead. Louis rushed to the next pod and the next, finding more of his crewmates all seemingly lifeless. Biting back his fear, Louis accessed a nearby terminal, fingers flying over the unfamiliar controls. Screens of data scrolled past until he found what he was looking for. Bile rose in his throat as he read. The Tarkalians had been experimenting on the captured humans, running brutal tests to try to discover the biological secret to humans' uncanny adaptability and resilience. Suddenly, an ear-splitting alarm sounded, the lab flashing with red warning lights. Louis had been discovered. Doors hissed open, and a squadron of guards rushed in, weapons pointed at him. At their head was Lyra, her eyes narrowed to slits. "So the little human thinks he can escape?" she hissed. Louis ripped the restrictive helmet off, revealing his human features. "I know your sick secret now, Lyra," he snarled. "I know what you've done to my people." Lyra let out a humorless laugh. "And what does it matter? Who would believe the word of a lowly human over the might of the Tarkalian Empire?" Louis slowly reached into his pocket and withdrew a small data drive. Lyra's eyes widened. "All the proof I need, right here," Louis said, waggling the drive. "Records of your twisted experiments." With an enraged screech, Lyra lunged for the drive. But Louis was faster. He smashed his fist into the nearest stasis pod, shattering the glass. Alarms shrieked. Louis grabbed the limp form of his crewmate and ran, sprinting for the escape pods as Lyra and the guards opened fire. Plasma bolts sizzled past Louis's head as he half-carried, half-dragged his crewmate into a pod. Slamming the launch button, the pod sealed and blasted free of the ship, shooting into the black void of space. As the pod hurtled through the stars, Louis looked back at the rapidly receding Tarkalian ship. Lyra probably thought he was trapped out here, doomed to drift forever. But she had no idea what humans were capable of. Louis would find a way to survive and bring Lyra to justice. Louis guided the escape pod down towards the planet's surface. As the pod descended through the atmosphere, he glanced back at the prone form of Samir, strapped into the seat behind him. His crewmate was still out cold, his breathing shallow. Louis prayed the ship had enough basic medical supplies to keep Samir stable. The pod touched down with a bone-rattling impact near the twisted wreckage of their colony ship. Louis popped the hatch and half-carried, half-dragged Samir out, setting him down a safe distance away. He got to work scavenging anything useful from the pod and the debris field. He stuffed salvaged equipment, ration packs, and a few Tarkalian weapons into a pack. Slinging Samir over his shoulders, Louis made his way to higher ground. He found a small cave just defensible enough to make camp. He laid Samir down and tended to his injuries as best he could, cleaning the wounds and administering the scant medical supplies. As the sun set over the horizon, Samir began to stir. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "Louis?" he croaked. "What happened? Where are we?" Louis helped him sit up and handed him a water pack. "What do you remember?" Samir shook his head, wincing. "Just alarms blaring, we were crashing, the Tarkalians shot us down, but everything after that is a blank." Louis filled him in on all that had transpired, waking up imprisoned on the Tarkalian ship, discovering the horrifying experiments and their narrow escape. He showed Samir the data drive. Samir's eyes widened in shock and revulsion. Over the next few weeks, the two men fortified their position, setting traps and defenses around their makeshift base. They took turns venturing out on recon missions, gathering what intel they could on Tarkalian operations on the planet's surface. It soon became clear that there was a major Tarkalian research facility not far from the wreckage of the human ship. Louis and Samir came to the horrifying conclusion that the rest of their crew must be held there, being subjected to the same experiments. One evening, while perched on a cliff overlooking the base, Louis spotted a group of Tarkalian guards, roughly escorting human prisoners inside. His heart leaped into his throat. Could there be other survivors from the crash? He and Samir swiftly put a plan into action. As the guards passed near their position, the two men leaped out, catching them by surprise. They subdued the guards with brutal efficiency, knocking them out cold. The human prisoners cowered back, clearly terrified. But as Louis and Samir revealed themselves, a spark of hope ignited in their eyes. "Who are you?" Louis asked. A woman stepped forward. "We're all that's left of the original colony. We managed to escape the crash, but we've been living in hiding. The Tarkalians have been hunting us down, taking us captive for their sick experiments." Then her eyes widened in recognition. "Louis, is that you?" Louis blinked, then shock dawned on his features. "Dr. Singh, Anaya?" Dr. Anaya Singh, the lead scientist on their mission, stood before him, her face gaunt and her hair matted but her eyes still sharp. Louis quickly explained all that had happened and showed her the evidence he carried. Anaya's face twisted in horror as she scanned the files. "My God, this is an atrocity," she breathed. "We have to get this evidence to Earth. Expose what the Tarkalians have done." "How?" Samir asked. "The Tarkalians are jamming any long-range communications." Anaya's eyes glinted with a hardened determination. "The base. They'll have a powerful comms array there, strong enough to punch a signal through their interference to human space." She turned to Louis and Samir, her gaze resolute. "You've already risked so much, but I'm asking you to do it again. Help me infiltrate that base. We'll save our people and broadcast the truth of the Tarkalians' crimes to the galaxy." Louis glanced at Samir, 1,000 unspoken words passing between them. This was a suicide mission, but what choice did they have? They couldn't leave their people to this fate. He faced Anaya, his jaw set. "We're with you." Together, the trio began to hatch a desperate plan, knowing the odds were stacked against them. But they had no other option. For the sake of their crewmates, for the sake of humanity itself, they had to try. And if they failed, they would make damn sure the Tarkalians paid for their crimes in blood. Louis, Samir, Anaya, and a dozen of the hardiest colonists spent days carefully approaching the Tarkalian base on foot, dodging enemy patrols with practiced stealth. Hearts pounding, they reached a waste disposal conduit on the base's perimeter. Wedging it open, they slipped inside one by one, weapons readied. The stench of alien refuse assaulted their nostrils as they crept through the trash-strewn utility tunnels. At a junction, Anaya signaled for them to split up as planned. She would lead most of the group to free their imprisoned crewmates. Louis and Samir went the opposite way, towards the communications center. "Good luck," Anaya whispered, clasping Louis's shoulder. He nodded grimly. Silently, Louis and Samir climbed into a cramped maintenance duct. They crawled through the tight metal confines, the only sound their jagged breathing and the soft scuff of their knees on the grates. After an interminable time, light spilled up ahead through a vent. They'd reached the comms array. Louis peered through the grill. The room appeared empty. He kicked the vent cover open and dropped down, Samir following. Banks of alien computers whirred and blinked around them. "Get that evidence transmitting," Louis said roughly, moving to guard the door, rifle up. "I'll cover you." Samir jacked into a terminal, and his fingers flew over the unfamiliar controls, brow furrowed in concentration. Louis's heart raced as he scanned the corridors. The seconds crawled by with agonizing slowness. A sudden boom of bootsteps jolted Louis into high alert. He sighted down his rifle, just as the doors burst inward, and a squad of Tarkalian guards charged in, energy weapons ablaze. At their head was Lyra, murder in her eyes. "Shit," Louis swore, opening fire. The acrid stench of ozone filled the air as bolts crisscrossed the room. Sparks showered from ruptured terminals. Louis ducked and rolled, laying down suppressing fire to shield Samir, who was still furiously working at the computer. A plasma bolt sizzled past Louis's cheek. He returned fire relentlessly, dropping 2 guards. But a pained gasp made him whirl around. Samir was crumpling to the floor, clutching his stomach, blood seeping between his fingers. Louis let loose a wordless roar of anguish and rage. Lyra was advancing on Samir, a vicious smirk twisting her features, her gun trained on the wounded man's head. Seeing red, Louis launched himself at her in a flying tackle. They hit the ground hard, Louis pummeling her with a frenzied flurry of blows. Lyra snarled and fought back savagely, her superior strength driving the breath from Louis's lungs. They grappled across the floor in a tangle of limbs. Louis's hand closed around Lyra's gun, and he wrenched it from her grasp, rolling on top of her and jamming the barrel under her chin. Chest heaving, Louis glared down at her with burning hatred, finger twitching on the trigger. Lyra glared back, teeth bared in defiance. Louis' human morality grappled with his primal thirst for vengeance. In that moment's hesitation, Lyra struck, punching a blade into Louis's shoulder. Blinding pain exploded through him, and he reeled back. The gun clattered away. Lyra flipped them over, pinning Louis down, the knife raised for a killing strike. A sudden chime from the computer terminal made her head snap up. Samir, with his final surge of strength, had slammed his fist down on the transmit button. Lyra's eyes went wide with horrified realization as the evidence began to broadcast. She let out an enraged screech, leaping towards Samir, weapon aimed at his head. "No!" Louis cried, throwing himself into the path of the shot. Searing agony tore through him, and he crumpled to the floor. Through blurred vision he saw Anaya and the colonists storm into the room, weapons blazing. Lyra cursed and fled with her remaining guards. Then Anaya was at Louis' side, hands pressing down hard on his wound. Her voice sounded oddly distant, thick with tears. "Louis, stay with me." She nodded, her tears dripping onto his face. "We did it. The transmission went through. It's over." Louis clawed his way back to consciousness, an indeterminable time later. He lay on a makeshift cot, his body a patchwork of bandages and dull, throbbing pain. Anaya sat next to him, her drawn face lighting up as his eyes fluttered open. "Louis," she breathed, "thank God." "Samir?" he asked hoarsely, already dreading the answer. Louis squeezed his eyes shut as hot tears spilled down his temples. Samir had been more than a crewmate. He'd been a brother in arms, a friend, and he'd given his life to expose the Tarkalians' atrocities. Louis reached out and gripped Anaya's hand, his jaw clenching with renewed purpose. Samir's sacrifice would not be in vain. Not now. Not ever. As Louis lay recovering, he knew this fight was far from over. The Tarkalians would come for them, enraged beyond measure. Let them come. Humanity would never stop fighting. And Louis would be leading the charge, for Samir and for every human the Tarkalians had brutalized. This was only the beginning. Louis crouched behind the boulder, his pulse pounding in his ears. The makeshift sensors they'd cobbled together from ship scrap had just pinged with an incoming vessel. Around him, the ragged band of survivors tensed, readying their weapons. Fear soured the air. "Incoming ship bearing 270, Anaya reported, her voice tight. "Could be Tarkalians." Louis gritted his teeth, trying to ignore the flare of pain from his barely healed wounds. In the weeks since their narrow escape from the research base, they'd been hounded mercilessly across the wilderness by vengeful Tarkalian forces. Supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. The colonists were reaching their breaking point. Louis had done his best to keep morale from crumbling completely, but he could see the doubt and despair growing in their eyes with each passing day. Now, it seemed their time had finally run out. "Defensive positions," Louis ordered hoarsely. "Prepare to engage." The survivors fanned out, taking cover among the rocks. They checked their weapons with shaking hands, the scavenged Tarkalian rifles nearly depleted of charge. Louis knew if this was a full enemy assault, they wouldn't last long, but he'd be damned if they'd go down without a fight. A dull roar filled the air as the ship descended through the clouds, but as it came into view, Louis froze. That silhouette, it wasn't Tarkalian, it was human. "Hold your fire," Louis shouted, hardly daring to hope. The ship settled to the ground in a blast of thrusters. A hatch hissed open, and a squad of heavily armed commandos poured out, fanning into a defensive perimeter. On their shoulders, the Earth flag stood out in sharp relief. A grizzled bear of a man strode down the ramp last, his eyes scanning the stunned survivors. He made a beeline for Louis. "Louis Hernandez?" the man asked. "Colonel Nathaniel Hawkins, Earth Defense Force." The colonel clasped Louis's hand in a firm shake. "We received your transmission. Took us a while to mobilize, but we're here now. We're here to take the fight to the Tarkalian bastards." Relief crashed through Louis like a wave, so intense his knees nearly buckled. "So Earth knows? About what the Tarkalians did to us?" Hawkins' face hardened. "The whole damn planet knows, and they're out for blood." He swept his gaze over the other survivors, his eyes softening a fraction. "We'll get you folks back to the ship, get you checked over and resupplied." But Louis shook his head. "With respect, sir, we're not going anywhere. This is our fight too. We want to see it through." Hawkins considered him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "Your reputation precedes you, Hernandez. They say you're a force to be reckoned with. We could use a man like you on the front lines." Louis felt a flicker of grim satisfaction. He thought of Samir, of the tortured colonists, of Lyra's mocking sneer. "Just point me at the Tarkalians, sir." As the survivors were ushered onto the human ship, a renewed sense of purpose settled over Louis. This fight was far from over, but now, with Earth's might at their back, they would finish it, and God help any Tarkalian who stood in their way. The Allied human forces, with Louis and the able-bodied survivors at their side, marched through the dense alien jungle. The air was thick with humidity and anticipation as the Tarkalian base loomed ahead, an imposing monolith of black metal bristling with defenses. Colonel Hawkins motioned the troops into position, his expression carved from granite. Louis clutched his rifle, adrenaline surging through his veins. This was it, the moment of reckoning. At Hawkins' signal, all hell broke loose. Human forces opened up with a blistering barrage of heavy weapons fire, mass accelerator rounds and plasma bolts chewing through the outer walls. Tarkalian energy shields flared and popped as the base's automated defenses struggled to return fire. Louis was in the thick of it, ducking and weaving, his rifle bucking in his hands as he put down one Tarkalian guard after another with ruthless precision. The simmering rage that had sustained him through the long weeks of hardship and grief now exploded to the surface, a red mist descending over his vision. He could see the other survivors fighting with equal ferocity, their faces contorted with the pain of remembered brutality. They were not soldiers, but farmers, scientists, engineers, and yet they threw themselves into the fray with a fury that rivaled any commando. Inch by blood-soaked inch, the human forces advanced, an implacable tide of retribution. Louis led the charge, his voice raw as he rallied the troops forward. Samir's face flashed before his eyes, a silent goad that drove him on. At last they breached the heart of the base. Smoke choked the corridors and klaxons blared as the remaining Tarkalian forces fell back in disarray. And there, amidst the chaos, was Lyra. Her once pristine uniform was torn and stained, her face streaked with grime. But her eyes still glinted with that same malevolent cruelty. She caught sight of Louis, and her lips peeled back in a feral snarl. They charged each other, weapons forgotten. This was a reckoning that could only be settled with fists and fury. They clashed in the center of the maelstrom, trading blows with a savagery that shocked even the hardened soldiers around them. Louis absorbed every punch, every kick, a small distant part of him relishing the pain. It fueled his rage, sharpened his focus. He pummeled Lyra with all the strength in his battered body, all the hate in his heart. She staggered beneath his onslaught, her superior Tarkalian strength flagging. With a final mighty roar, Louis seized her by the throat and slammed her to the deck, his fists hammering down again and again until she went limp, her face a ruined mess. Chest heaving, Louis rolled off her and staggered to his feet. He looked down at Lyra's unconscious form, a boiling sea of emotions churning in his gut. He wanted to finish it, to snuff out her vile existence once and for all. But then he thought of Samir, of what he would have wanted. Louis's friend had died for justice, not vengeance. Samir would have wanted Lyra to face a reckoning in the courts of Earth, to have her crimes dragged into the light. So Louis let her live. He turned his back on Lyra's broken body, the base alarms still blaring. With their leader fallen, the Tarkalian forces quickly crumpled. Hawkins and his men moved in, rounding up the remaining enemy combatants. As the smoke cleared, the true horror of the Tarkalian base revealed itself. Emaciated human prisoners staggered from hidden cells, blinking in the sudden light. A pall of grief and rage fell over the liberating forces. But even as medics rushed to tend to the wounded, Louis's eyes were drawn to a shrouded figure laid out on the deck. His heart seized. Slowly, painfully, he knelt beside Samir's body, reaching out to touch his friend's cold brow. There were no words, nothing that could encompass the enormity of the loss, the depth of the sacrifice. Louis could only bow his head and let silent tears course down his cheeks, Samir's tags clutched in his fist. It was over. The battle was won, but the cost had been so very high. As the smoke of battle cleared, The human task force moved with practiced efficiency, securing the captured Tarkalian base. They disarmed and rounded up the remaining enemy combatants, herding them into makeshift detention centers. Lyra, once so proud and vicious, was bound and shackled, her head bowed in defeat as she was marched away under a phalanx of grim-faced human guards. Louis watched the proceedings with a distant, numbed sort of satisfaction. The adrenaline of combat was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a hollowness in his chest. Samir was gone. So many had been lost, but they had won. They had exposed the Tarkalians' crimes for all the galaxy to see. Colonel Hawkins approached Louis, his face lined with exhaustion but his eyes shining with respect. "You did it, son," he said, clapping Louis on the shoulder. "You and your people, you brought those bastards to their knees." Louis could only nod, his throat too tight for words. In the days that followed, as the human forces secured their foothold, word came that a delegation from the Galactic Council was en route. They had received the transmission, seen the damning evidence of the Tarkalians' atrocities. They were coming to investigate, to bear witness to the horrors that had been uncovered. Hawkins, seeing the steel in Louis's eyes and the respect the colonists held for him, appointed Louis as the human liaison to the Council investigators. "You're the best man for this, Hernandez," Hawkins said firmly. "You've been in the thick of it from the start. You make sure those Council bigwigs understand the full extent of what happened here." Louis, despite the exhaustion that dragged at his bones, despite the grief that clouded his heart, squared his shoulders and accepted the task. For Samir. For all those who had suffered and died at the Tarkalians' hands. When the Council ships arrived, a gleaming array of diplomatic vessels that dwarfed the human warships, Louis was there to greet them. He endured their probing questions, their clinical detachment, and laid bare the full scope of the Tarkalians' crimes. He presented the damning experimental records, the cold, hard data that spoke of unimaginable cruelty. He led them through the twisted labs, still stained with the blood of human victims. And he brought forward the survivors, the haunted, broken remnants of the colonies, to give their tearful testimonies. Through it all, Louis felt a simmering anger, a righteous fury that these atrocities had been allowed to happen, that it had taken so much suffering, so much loss, for the galaxy to take notice. But even as the Council investigators expressed their horror, their sympathy, Louis sensed something amiss. There were undercurrents of politics at play, hidden agendas that whispered beneath the surface. It all came to a head when Lyra, still proud and defiant even in her defeat, was brought before the Council for questioning. Under the withering glare of the assembled delegates, she sneered and spat her contempt. But then, perhaps seeking some shred of leniency, she let slip a bombshell revelation. The Tarkalians, she admitted with a vicious smile, had not been acting alone. There were those on the Council, a shadowy faction known as the Shadow Hand, who had secretly backed the experiments, who had seen the humans as perfect fodder for their twisted ambitions. The Council chamber erupted into chaos, the investigators shouting for order as the implications sank in. Louis could only watch in numb disbelief as the ugly truth spilled out. The Shadow Hand, with operatives at the highest levels of government, had orchestrated it all. The Tarkalians had been but eager pawns in their game. In the end, the Council had no choice but to condemn the Tarkalians, to promise swift justice for their crimes. But Louis knew it was a hollow victory. The true enemies, the puppet masters lurking in the shadows, remained untouched. As the Council ships departed, carrying the Tarkalian prisoners back to face trial and judgment, Louis stood alone on the scorched earth of the battlefield. He looked up at the stars, at the vast expanse of the galaxy that had once seemed so full of promise. But now he saw only the looming spectre of a far greater fight ahead. The Shadow Hand would not rest. They would not let their schemes be so easily thwarted, and Louis knew with a grim certainty that humanity had just been dragged into a cosmic struggle they were woefully unprepared for. He thought of Samir, of all the brave souls who had fought and bled and died to bring them to this moment. Their sacrifice could not be in vain. Louis turned his gaze back to the stars, his jaw set with resolve. He didn't know what the future held, what trials and challenges awaited, but he knew one thing for certain. The battle for humanity's place among the stars, for their very right to exist, had only just begun. Months after the victory over the Tarkalians, Louis found himself on Earth, the weight of his new responsibilities as humanity's ambassador to the Galactic Council heavy on his shoulders. He spent countless hours locked in his office, poring over intelligence reports and communiques, working tirelessly to unravel the web of the Shadowhand's influence that seemed to permeate every corner of the galaxy. Progress was maddeningly slow. For every lead Louis and his allies in the Council's Internal Affairs Division chased down, a dozen more dead ends sprang up in their place. The Shadowhand's tendrils ran deep, their operatives embedded at the highest levels of power across countless worlds. Frustration gnawed at Louis, but he refused to let it deter him. He owed it to Samir, to all those who had suffered and died at the hands of the Shadowhand's machinations, to see this through. Late one night, as Louis sat hunched over his desk, the glow of his computer terminal casting shadows across his exhausted face, the hairs on the back of his neck suddenly stood on end. Instinct screamed a warning, and he dove to the side, just as a blade sliced through the air where his head had been a heartbeat before. Louis rolled to his feet, adrenaline surging through his veins as he faced his attacker. The assassin was clad in form-fitting black armor, their face obscured by a featureless helmet. They moved with the deadly grace of a trained killer, a long, wicked-looking knife gripped in each hand. The assassin lunged forward, blades flashing. Louis backpedaled, snatching up a heavy paperweight from his desk and hurling it at his attacker's head. The assassin ducked, and the paperweight shattered against the wall, but the momentary distraction was all Louis needed. He charged forward, grappling with the assassin. They crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs, Louis grunting as a knife blade sliced along his ribs. He trapped the assassin's knife hand and slammed it repeatedly against the floor until the blade clattered free. The assassin bucked and twisted beneath him with inhuman strength, but Louis held on grimly, blood roaring in his ears. He snaked an arm around the assassin's throat and squeezed with all his might, muscles straining. The assassin thrashed and clawed at Louis's face, but he didn't relent. Spots danced before his eyes, his lungs screaming for air, but he maintained his chokehold until, finally, the assassin went limp. Louis released his hold and staggered to his feet, chest heaving. He quickly secured the unconscious assassin with restraints from his desk, then reached for his comm to summon security. Hours later, Louis stood in a darkened interrogation cell, staring through the one-way glass at the captured assassin. The Shadowhand operative sat shackled to a chair under a harsh light, their helmet removed to reveal a pale, androgynous face. Louis's hands clenched into fists at his sides. When the assassin had finally regained consciousness, it had taken mere minutes for the Council's interrogators to break them. What they had revealed chilled Louis to his core. The Shadowhand was close, so very close, to perfecting a bioweapon of unimaginable destructive potential, a virus that could target specific genetic markers, tailor-made to wipe out entire species with ruthless efficiency. And their first targets were to be humans. But the assassin had let slip one crucial piece of information before succumbing to the interrogation: the location of a secret Shadowhand research facility, hidden away on a remote, uncharted world, the place where this apocalyptic virus was being developed. Louis wasted no time. He immediately brought his findings to the small circle of council members he knew he could trust, those few who were dedicated to rooting out the Shadowhand's corruption. They quickly assembled a covert strike team, the best of the best from a dozen worlds, and Louis made it clear in no uncertain terms that he would be leading the mission personally. Now as Louis stood in the armory, methodically checking his weapons and gear, he could feel the weight of the task ahead settling on his shoulders. The stakes couldn't be higher. If they failed, if the Shadowhand succeeded in unleashing their bioweapon, it could mean the end of humanity, the end of everything. Louis slammed a magazine into his rifle, his jaw clenched with grim determination. No matter the cost, no matter the odds, he would not let that happen. The strike team moved like ghosts through the twisting corridors of the Shadowhand facility, The only sound, the soft scuff of their boots on the metal grating. They had landed undetected, neutralizing the perimeter guards with ruthless efficiency, but Louis knew their presence would not go unnoticed for long. He signaled for the team to split up, each small group moving to secure a different sector of the facility, according to the schematics provided by the captured assassin. Louis took point for his own team, leading them deeper into the heart of the complex. Suddenly alarms blared to life, the corridor lighting shifting to a pulsing red. Louis cursed under his breath. So much for stealth. Around the next bend, a squad of Shadow Hand soldiers burst into view, weapons already firing. Louis and his team dove for cover, returning fire. The air filled with the sizzling heat of plasma bolts and the staccato rattle of automatic weapons. Louis leaned out from behind a support column, squeezing off precise shots. 2 Shadow Hand soldiers crumpled, but more were pouring in to take their place. They were badly outnumbered. "Fall back!" Louis roared over the din of battle. "Leapfrog retreat!" Laying down a withering hail of covering fire, Louis and his team began a fighting withdrawal, bounding back from one piece of cover to the next. But in the chaos of the firefight, Louis found himself cut off, separated from his squad. Plasma bolts sizzled past his head as he sprinted down a side passage, the shouts of the Shadow Hand pursuers echoing behind him. He hastily consulted the schematics on his wrist display. If he was reading it right, this corridor should lead him to the central lab complex, the heart of the facility, Louis gritted his teeth and pushed himself harder, ignoring the burning in his lungs and the ache of his old injuries. He had to reach that lab. Everything depended on it. He burst through a set of heavy blast doors and skidded to a halt, rifle snapping up to the ready. The lab was cavernous, filled with banks of humming machinery and towering rows of stasis tanks. And standing at the center of it all, a smug smile on his aristocratic face, was Zoran. Louis recognized him instantly from the intelligence briefings. A high-ranking member of the Council, one of the Shadow Hand's most influential and dangerous operatives. "Ah, the tenacious Mr. Hernandez," Zoran said, his voice smooth and cultured. "I must commend you. You and your little band have proven annoyingly persistent." Louis kept his rifle trained on Zoran's head, his finger hovering over the trigger. "It's over, Zoran. We know about the bioweapon. You'll never get the chance to deploy it." Zoran chuckled, seemingly unconcerned by the weapon pointed at him. "Oh, I rather think we will. You see, the weapon is already complete. Even now it is being loaded onto a ship, ready to be unleashed upon an unsuspecting galaxy." He spread his arms, his smile turning predatory. "Can you imagine it, Mr. Hernandez? A galaxy remade in the Shadow Hand's image. Lesser species, like your precious humanity, will either submit to our rule or be wiped out. A cleansing fire, leaving only the strong to inherit the stars." Louis's finger tightened on the trigger, rage boiling up inside him. But before he could fire, Zoran's hand flashed to his side and a small, disc-shaped device skittered across the floor towards Louis. Acting on pure instinct, Louis hurled himself backwards just as the device detonated in a blinding flash and a thunderclap of sound. The concussive blast flung him like a ragdoll, slamming him into a bank of machinery. Through ringing ears and blurred vision, Louis saw Zoran advancing on him, a plasma pistol in his hand. Louis tried to raise his rifle, but his arms felt like lead, his body sluggish and unresponsive. Zoran stood over him, aiming the pistol at Louis's head. "A valiant effort, Mr. Hernandez, but ultimately futile. The Shadow Hand's victory is inevitable." Louis glared up at him, putting every ounce of defiance he could muster into his voice. "Go to hell." Zoran's finger tightened on the trigger. Acting more on desperate instinct than conscious thought, Louis's hand scrabbled at his belt, closing around the smooth oval of a frag grenade. He pulled the pin and released the spoon, letting the grenade roll from his fingers. Zoran's eyes widened, and he tried to leap back, but Louis lunged forward, ignoring the white-hot lance of pain in his side, and tackled Zoran around the waist. The grenade detonated. The world dissolved into fire and pain and deafening noise. Louis felt himself flying through the air, felt the searing heat of the blast, and then a crushing impact as he slammed into something hard. Darkness encroached on the edges of his vision. Through the smoke and ringing in his ears, Louis could just make out Zoran's crumpled form lying a few feet away, a pool of dark blood spreading beneath him. With a titanic effort, Louis dragged himself to his hands and knees. His whole body screamed in protest, but he forced himself upright, staggering over to the row of stasis tanks. There in the centermost tank was a cylindrical device the size of a soda can, pulsing with an ominous green light. The bioweapon. Louis' shaking hands scrabbled at the release controls. The tank hissed open, and he reached inside, his fingers closing around the cold metal of the cylinder. He turned as booted feet pounded into the lab behind him, but it was his own strike team, battered and bloodied but alive. Leaning heavily on the shoulder of one of his teammates, Louis limped from the lab, the bioweapon clutched protectively to his chest. In the distance, he could hear the sounds of renewed fighting as Council reinforcements stormed the facility, mopping up the last pockets of Shadowhand resistance. But even as relief washed over him, Louis knew this was far from over. They had cut off the head of the snake, but the Shadowhand was Hydra. More would rise to take Zoran's place. And neither would Louis. No matter how long it took, no matter the odds, he would keep fighting. For humanity, for the memory of Samir and all those lost. This was his mission now, his war, and he would see it through to the bitter end. In the weeks following the strike on the Shadowhand facility, Louis found himself thrust into a new role. With the Council reeling from the revelation of just how deep the Shadowhand's corruption ran, trust was a rare commodity. No one knew who might be a secret operative, waiting to strike at the heart of the galactic government. Despite his injuries, Louis was appointed to lead a special task force charged with rooting out these hidden agents. It was a daunting task, but one he was uniquely suited for. He had seen the Shadowhand's depravity firsthand, had come closer than anyone to unraveling their schemes. Louis' first order of business was assembling his team. He needed people he could trust absolutely, those who had proven themselves in the heat of battle. Anaya was an obvious choice. Her bravery and quick thinking had saved countless lives, including Louis' own. He also recruited a handful of key council members, those who had been most vocal in their condemnation of the Shadowhand. Together they began their secret investigation, working in the shadows just as their enemy did. They chased down leads and gathered evidence, piecing together the Shadowhand's vast network bit by bit. It was dangerous work. The Shadowhand, now aware of the threat Louis and his team posed, were more ruthless than ever. Assassins seemed to lurk around every corner, waiting for the slightest opening to strike. Louis and his team were forced to be constantly on guard, always watching their backs. They could trust no one outside their tight-knit circle, never knowing where the next attack might come from. Their investigation took them to the darkest corners of the galaxy, places where the Council's influence was weak and corruption reigned. They infiltrated the seedy underbelly of sprawling cities, delving into the slums and back alleys where the dregs of society dwelled. In dingy bars and smoke-filled backrooms, they met with informants and criminals, anyone who might have a scrap of information about the Shadowhand's activities. It was a dangerous game, one that required Louis and his team to blend into the shadows themselves, to become a part of the underworld they sought to destroy. Piece by piece, a picture began to emerge. The Shadowhand's influence extended far beyond what they had ever imagined. They had operatives not just in the Council, but in the governments and militaries of dozens of worlds. Species that had long been at odds with each other were secretly controlled by the same puppet masters, their conflict stoked for the Shadowhand's benefit. The scale of it was staggering. The conspiracy seemed to have no end, no corner of the galaxy left untouched by their vile machinations. As they closed in on key Shadowhand figures, the danger only grew. Ambushes became more frequent, the attacks more brutal. Louis and his team were constantly forced into desperate firefights and harrowing escapes. One particularly close call saw Louis and Anaya pinned down in a dilapidated warehouse, a kill squad of Shadowhand assassins closing in. Plasma bolts filled the air, the stench of ozone and scorched metal choking their lungs. She fought like a woman possessed, driving the assassins back with a hail of fire. She dragged Louis to cover, desperately working to stem the bleeding. As Louis drifted in and out of consciousness, he found himself fixating on Anaya's face, on the fierce determination in her eyes. In that moment, through the haze of pain, he realized his feelings for her had grown beyond simple camaraderie or friendship. But there was no time to dwell on such things. As soon as he was stable enough to move, they were back in the fight, pushing forward with their investigation. It was after this close call that they received the tip that could change everything. A contact deep within the criminal underworld passed them information about a major shadow hand meeting, one that would bring together the organization's top leadership. It was happening on a small lawless moon on the fringes of known space, a place where the council held no sway. If Louis and his team could infiltrate this meeting, they could strike a crippling blow to the shadow hand, cut off the head of the snake. But even as they made their plans, they knew it was a risk. The shadow hand would be expecting an attack, would have their strongest defenses in place. This meeting was the perfect opportunity for a trap. Louis and his team prepared for the mission, checking and double-checking their gear. They pored over every scrap of intelligence they had, planning for every contingency. As they boarded their unmarked ship and set off into the void, a grim determination settled over the team. They knew the odds were against them, knew that this mission could very well be their last. But they also knew that the fate of the galaxy hung in the balance. If they failed, the Shadow Hand would be free to continue their reign of terror unopposed. Louis looked around at his team, at the resolute faces of those who had become more than just colleagues, but a family forged in the crucible of battle. For them, for the billions of innocent lives across the stars, failure was not an option. As the ship hurtled through the void towards the distant moon, Louis steeled himself for what was to come. The Shadow Hand had taken so much from him, from all of them. It was time to take the fight to them, to bring their dark deeds into the light. No matter the cost, no matter the danger, they would see this through to the end. The Shadow Hand would learn that humanity, that the free peoples of the galaxy, would never submit to their tyranny. The battle for the future was about to begin, and Louis and his team would be the tip of the spear, the shining beacon of hope in the darkness. Louis and his team prepped their gear meticulously, checking and rechecking every weapon and piece of equipment. The mood was grim, the weight of the impending mission hanging heavy in the air. They were headed into the heart of darkness, to the lawless moon where the Shadow Hand leadership was gathering. It was a chance to cut off the head of the snake, but they all knew the risks. This was likely a trap, and even if they succeeded, there would be a steep price to pay. As the unmarked ship sliced through the void towards the distant moon, Louis found Anaya in the armory, her face set in lines of determination as she cleaned her rifle. She looked up as he approached, her eyes softening slightly. Anaya nodded, slotting the final piece of her weapon into place with a decisive click, "As I'll ever be." We all knew this day was coming. Louis placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the coiled tension there. "We're going to make it through this. We're going to end this, once and for all." Anaya covered his hand with her own, her grip strong and steady. "I know, I've got your back, Louis, to the end." The ship shuddered as it entered the moon's atmosphere, the hull groaning under the strain. Louis and Anaya joined the rest of the team in the drop bay, locking and loading as the ramp lowered. They emerged into a hellscape, the moon's surface a blasted wasteland of jagged rock and swirling dust. In the distance, the hulking silhouette of the warehouse complex loomed, a dilapidated structure of rusted metal and shattered glass. As they approached, picking their way carefully through the debris field, a hail of blaster fire suddenly erupted from the complex. Crimson bolts stitched the ground around them, superheated slugs whining past their heads. "Ambush!" someone yelled, diving for cover. Louis cursed, rolling behind a boulder as his team scattered, returning fire. It was a killing field, with no cover, and the Shadow Hand forces entrenched in superior positions. "Push forward!" Louis roared over the din of battle. "We have to get inside." Inch by blood-soaked inch they advanced, leapfrogging from cover to cover. Louis led the charge, his rifle spitting plasma as he stormed the enemy lines. Anaya was right beside him, her face streaked with grime and blood, a battle cry on her lips. They breached the perimeter in a hail of shattered glass and twisted metal, blowing the doors open with breaching charges. Inside was chaos, a labyrinth of smoke-filled corridors and strobe lights. Shadowhand forces seemed to lurk around every corner, appearing like phantoms in the swirling haze. Louis and his team carved a path of destruction, fighting room to room, hall to hall. The floor grew slick with blood and spent shell casings, the air choked with cordite and death. At last they reached the central chamber, a cavernous space filled with banks of humming machinery, and there, arrayed before them like a dark conclave, were the Shadowhand leaders. Louis recognized the faces of council members, of high-ranking officials from a dozen worlds. But it was the figure at the center that made Louis's blood run cold, a human clad in the uniform of an Earth admiral, his face hawkish and severe. Admiral Donovan, a man presumed dead for years, lost on some distant classified mission. Donovan spread his arms wide, a predatory smile on his lips. "Luis Hernandez, I've been waiting for this moment." Louis stepped forward, his rifle trained on Donovan's heart. "You're supposed to be dead." "The reports of my death were greatly exaggerated," Donovan chuckled darkly. "A necessary deception to allow me to work unimpeded." "You're Shadowhand," Louis snarled. "You betrayed your own people." "I'm trying to save our people," Donovan snapped. "The galaxy is a harsh and unforgiving place, Louis. Humanity needs to be strong, ruthless if we're to survive. The Shadowhand understands this. Their vision is the only way to ensure our dominance." Donovan extended a hand, his eyes glinting. "Join us, Louis. You've seen firsthand the threats that lurk in the stars. Help us make humanity strong. Help us forge an empire that will stand for 1,000 years. Louis recoiled in disgust. "I'd rather die than join your twisted cause. Humanity will endure through unity and courage, not fear and oppression." He moved, a blur of speed and precision. Louis barely had time to register the biotech enhancements that rippled under Donovan's skin before the Admiral was on him, a whirlwind of punishing blows. They clashed in the center of the chamber, trading punches and kicks that would have shattered bones on a normal human. Around them, Louis's team engaged the other Shadowhand leaders, a desperate close-quarters battle erupting. Donovan was monstrously strong, shrugging off blows that would have felled a Tarkalian warrior. Louis strained to keep up, feeling his enhanced muscles screaming in protest. They crashed through equipment, smashed into walls, neither giving an inch. Anaya's voice crackled over the comm, strained and breathless. "Louis, I'm in their systems. I'm going to try and shut down their weapons." Seconds later, the tide turned. The Shadowhand forces suddenly found their high-tech weapons dead in their hands, the power cells drained. Louis' team pressed the advantage, cutting them down with ruthless efficiency. Donovan faltered just for a second, his eyes widening as he realized the battle was lost. It was all the opening Louis needed. He pressed the attack, hammering Donovan with a relentless flurry of strikes. The Admiral went down, his biotech enhancements sparking and sputtering. Louis stood over him, chest heaving, his fist poised for the final blow. Donovan laughed, a wet and broken sound. "Do it, Louis. Kill me, but it won't matter. Cut off one head and another will take its place. The Shadowhand is eternal." Louis hesitated, the truth of Donovan's words sinking in. The Shadowhand was more than just these individuals in this room. It was an idea, a poison that had taken root in the hearts of those who craved power above all else. As long as that darkness existed, the Shadowhand would endure. But so too would those who stood against them, those who believed in unity, in hope, in the fundamental right of all beings to live free. Louis thought of Samir, of the brave souls who had given everything in this fight. Louis let his fist fly, a knockout blow that echoed through the chamber. Donovan crumpled unconscious. Around them, the last of the Shadowhand forces fell, subdued by Louis's triumphant team. It was a victory, hard-fought and costly, but Louis knew in his bones that the fight was far from over. This was just one battle in a war that would span years, perhaps decades. But as he stood there shoulder to shoulder with his team, with the woman he had grown to love, Louis knew that as long as there were those willing to stand against the darkness, there would always be hope. In the days following the raid on the Shadowhand meeting, Louis found himself swept up in a whirlwind of activity. The council chambers were abuzz with talk of the daring operation, and Louis and his team were called upon to give testimony after testimony, recounting every detail of the mission. Commendations and accolades were heaped upon them. They were hailed as heroes, the saviors of the galaxy. But as Louis stood before the sea of applauding delegates, he felt strangely hollow. The thrill of victory, so intoxicating in the moment, had faded, leaving behind only a bone-deep weariness. He thought of Donovan's words, of the insidious reach of the Shadowhand. Even with so many key members captured or killed, Louis knew their ideology would persist. Cut off one head, and another would rise to take its place. It was a hydra he could spend a lifetime fighting and never truly defeat. "Louis, are you all right? You've been distant since the raid." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm just tired, Anaya. Tired of fighting, tired of losing people. I thought I'd feel different after we took down the Shadowhand, but I just feel empty." She touched his arm gently. "I understand, but Louis, we've made a real difference. The galaxy is a safer place because of what we've done." "For how long?" he asked, his voice rough. "The Shadowhand's ideology, it's like a cancer. It spreads and corrupts. We can't kill an idea, Anaya. No matter how many raids we go on, there will always be those who crave power at any cost." Anaya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The Council is forming a special task force to help rebuild trust and root out any remaining Shadowhand influence. They've asked me to lead it." She hesitated, then continued, "I want you with me, Louis. I need someone I can trust absolutely." The return to Earth was bittersweet. Louis was greeted as a hero with parades and speeches and endless interviews, but it all felt distant, unreal. He smiled and waved and said the right things, but inside he felt numb. His old life, his old self, no longer seemed to fit. He wandered through his days like a ghost, going through the motions, but feeling no connection to the world around him. At night he was haunted by the faces of those he'd lost: Samir, Donovan, the countless others who had died in this war. He knew he should feel pride in what he'd accomplished, in the blow they'd struck against the Shadowhand. But all he could think about was how much further there was to go, how many more battles lay ahead. In the end, it was a news report that decided his path. A remote colony had been attacked, the work of a warlord who had risen in the power vacuum, left by the Shadowhand's defeat. Innocent lives had been lost, and the Council was slow to respond, mired in bureaucracy and politics. Louis watched the footage of burning homes and crying children, and something ignited within him. He couldn't sit back and do nothing. He couldn't wait for the Council to act. He made his preparations quietly, reaching out to a select few he knew he could trust. Some were former members of his team, others were those he'd fought beside in the resistance. They were all like him, warriors who couldn't lay down their arms while injustice reigned. They met in secret, on a nameless moon far from prying eyes. There they forged a pact. They would be the watchdogs, the galaxy's silent protectors. They would hunt down the remnants of the Shadowhand and any other threat to the innocent, no matter where it hid. They would operate outside Council law, doing what needed to be done. It was a hard path, one that would make them fugitives and renegades, but it was the only path Louis could see. As they made their plans and prepared their ship, Louis felt a sense of purpose return to him. This was who he was, who he had always been. A protector, a guardian. He would spend the rest of his days fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. No matter the cost, no matter the odds, he would be the light in the darkness. And maybe, just maybe, he could find a measure of peace along the way. Years blurred together as Louis and his watchdogs waged their secret war. They struck hard and fast, appearing from the shadows to take down slavers, pirates, and tyrants. Their legend grew, whispered in the darkest corners of the galaxy. To some they were heroes, guardian angels who appeared in the darkest hour. To others they were dangerous vigilantes, operating without oversight or accountability. Louis didn't care about the labels. All that mattered was the mission, the never-ending fight against those who would prey on the weak. They had victories and they had losses. Each death hit Louis hard, but he carried on, driven by the memory of those he'd failed to save. He grew harder, more ruthless, a living weapon honed by endless battle. But even as his legend grew, Louis knew his time was running out. He could feel it in his bones, in the ache of old wounds that never fully healed. He was getting slower, his reflexes dulled by age and fatigue. In the end, it was a mission like any other. A warlord, rising to power in a distant system, his cruelty and ambition unchecked. Louis and his team infiltrated his stronghold, fighting their way to the heart of the compound. They found the warlord in his command center, surrounded by his elite guard. Louis charged forward, his weapons blazing, his battle cry echoing off the walls. He fought like a man possessed, cutting down enemies left and right. But there were too many and he was too slow. A blast caught him in the chest, searing through his armor. He fell to his knees, blood seeping between his fingers. His team fought on, driven by desperation and fury. They cut down the last of the guards, the warlord falling under a hail of blaster fire. Louis leaned against a wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His vision was blurring, the edges of the world turning grey. He could feel his life slipping away, the cold creeping in. His team gathered around him, their faces etched with grief. They knew there was nothing to be done, no medical aid that could save him now. As he lay there, his blood pooling on the cold metal floor, Louis found his thoughts turning to the past, to all the choices he'd made, the paths he'd walked. He thought of Samir, of Anaya, of all those he'd loved and lost. He'd made mistakes, so many mistakes. The cost had been high, paid in blood and tears, but he'd also made a difference. He'd shown the galaxy that one man, driven by an unshakable conviction, could stand against the tide of darkness. His team was saying something, their voices urgent and pleading, but Louis couldn't hear them anymore. The world was fading away, the pain receding like a distant tide. As he closed his eyes for the last time, Louis found a measure of peace. The fight would go on without him. There would always be those who stood against the darkness, who carried the light. His team would carry on his legacy, would continue to be the watchdogs the galaxy needed. And somewhere in a place beyond pain and sorrow, he knew he would see his lost loved ones again. Samir, his parents, all those who had gone before. His last breath left him, a whisper in the stillness. And Luis Hernandez, the man who had been a hero and a renegade, a savior and a scourge, passed from the world. But his legacy lived on, a story told in hushed tones across 1,000 worlds, the story of a man who had given everything to protect the innocent, who had never stopped fighting for what he believed in. In the darkest corners of the galaxy, where the shadows gathered and evil lurked, the name of Luis Hernandez was a whisper of hope, a promise of justice. He had been the watchdog, the guardian, and though he was gone, his spirit would endure a light in the darkness forever. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.